alrighty, thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks for the intro, Bramley. So, yep, I'll be talking to you today about Maestro, which you've probably never heard of. Has anyone actually heard of Maestro before? Oh, wow, there's actually more than one hand. Fantastic. So, almost all of you have never heard of it before. So, this is a lightning talk. I'm going to be talking really fast because I managed to come up with lots more slides and content than I expected. So I'll just quickly give you a brief intro to what I'm talking about, some theory about Maestro, and then get into the code demo, which I think is probably the most interesting bit of the whole thing. Now, for those of you who are in software, whether you're in development, QAs, or business, you've probably seen at some point there's the test pyramid. You've got unit tests on the bottom, integration tests in the middle, and the pointy bit is end-to-end testing. And that's pretty much the standard view of how we do software today, or software development today. Very controversial most of the time. Someone told you otherwise, they're probably trying to just be controversial. This is a great table I pinched off because I'm a Flutter GBE, off the Flutter documentation website. It's a great way of quickly illustrating the trade-offs between the different types of testing. The reason it's called unit, widget, and integration tests is that's the Flutter terminology for those three layers of the pyramid, roughly. It's not quite one-to-one, but it just basically demonstrates that in all of engineering, as probably in most of life, everything's a bit of a trade-off. If anyone tells you they've got the silver bullet, the magic solution to something, they're just trying to sell you snake oil. There's always trade-offs, there's always pros and cons to anything, and in testing it's the same thing. There's always things that each type of test does better than the other type of test, and that's why you need all of them, not just one. So today I'm talking about end-to-end testing. So what end-to-end testing is really in a good spot to do is your high-value user interactions. We, in the electrical engineering trade, sometimes call them smoke tests because it's the kind of test when you plug things in and you test them. If the magic smoke comes out, something's not quite working right. So I like to use that since I used to be, I sort of was an electrical engineer at one point. I recommend using, and this is just my personal preference, release builds of your apps for end-to-end testing, and if possible, running them in production. That might be a little bit scary, so a lot of places will do it in, say, a staging environment or a testing environment. But the thing is, you're trying to do an end-to-end test to make sure all the actual bits of your system work, and the bits that you're most interested in are the ones that your users are using, not your test environment. Like, your users don't know if the test environment is broken or is down, but they do if your production is. Now, on the downsides, they're notoriously slow, resource intensive, especially like if you try and run them in CI. These days, CIs are usually in virtual machines. Those virtual machines are not super great performance when you're running end-to-end tests. Oh, sorry, I should say from a mobile app point of view. All of the things I'm talking about today are from a mobile app development point of view, not from a web development point of view, not a back-end development point of view, mobile apps, Android and iOS, through the lens of Flutter. And they're also notoriously flaky, which gives them quite a bad reputation in software engineering circles. So what is Maestro? Having done that really quick intro to testing, Maestro describes itself, this is on their website, as the simplest and most effective mobile UI testing framework. From my point of view, it's an end-to-end testing tool, although it's basically UI testing, so it doesn't have to be end-to-end testing, but that's where it's quite useful. It's open source, it's for Android and iOS only, so yeah, no web, no desktop. It uses the standard accessibility features on iOS and Android to run the tests, which is mostly a good thing. And it leans into the inherent nature of the UI testing, or UI testing being flaky. So they actually embrace the flakiness and try to make that something that is easier for you to deal with by using Maestro. Now, the features I like about Maestro is easy to install. It's got great developer experience with its CLI tooling. I'm a CLI kind of person, so you might not find that as great, but for CLI people it's great. It's got a very small and simple YAML-based domain-specific language for writing the testing scripts. However, there's also JavaScript available for integration automation, so I'll be showing you both of those shortly. There's also a web-based studio tool, as they call it, which is really like a mini IDE for their testing. I'll hopefully have enough time to show you that as well. And there's also built-in screen recording, but with the danger sign that currently, to make the experience as best they can, it needs to go via a web service, which might not be something you want, especially in a commercial environment. So there's the warning that you might not want to use it if that's an issue from wherever you're doing the tests. So for anyone who might be familiar with Flutter, Flutter actually has a thing called integration tests, which basically cover the same sort of domain as what I just listed for Maestro. So why on earth am I talking about Maestro and not Flutter integration tests, which do roughly the same sort of thing? Well, it's because of that roughly bit. There's a whole bunch of things that, as much as I am a fan of Flutter, like I'm a Flutter GDE, goes with turf, Flutter integrations are not the best at some things, and those things include the fact that you need to be a Flutter developer to write them for a start, because they're written in Dart. They're basically written in the same way we write our Flutter app code. Maestro Studio, on the other hand, lets anyone basically write or develop, create and write the tests. So no need to be a Dart or Flutter developer. There's no need to install any of the developer tooling that you need to write the Flutter integration tests, because like I said, they're basically the same as writing Flutter apps. Basically for Android Maestro testing, which is what I'll be covering, because this is a GBG after all, we won't be talking about the iOS side of things, even though it's well covered. Just the APK is enough to run your tests, and that's what I'll be showing today. Also, because of the use of accessibility IDs, there's no need to know the internal details of the Flutter widgets that you're, or the UI that you're testing. It's real black box testing. It's really, all you need to know is what is there in the app from the user's point of view. And it works with native framework UIs. This is more of a Flutter thing than an Android and iOS thing, because Flutter essentially draws its own widgets, its own UI, but sometimes you end up having some native UI as part of your Flutter app, or is shown while your Flutter app is running. Like for instance, a classic thing, you won't see it today because I'm doing Android and iOS, but iOS will prompt you to save your credentials when you log in into the keychain, and that's a bit of iOS built-in UI. It's not part of your app, but it'll still show up and it will still mark up your tests really nicely if your test framework can't handle that. Maestro does, Flutter integration tests do not. And there's also the fact that it works with web views, which again, Flutter integration tests do not. And after lots of fast talking, I've got to the demo part of it, so I can actually jump to some code and start showing what this is all about. Now, we don't, like I promised, we don't need to see any app development code. We just need to see the Maestro stuff. So basically what I've got here is a folder with some Maestro flows. This is a Maestro flow, like I promised. It's just basic YAML, and it's fairly readable. Like if we ignore the top bit for now, if you have a look at that, that looks fairly reasonable. Like, you know, when something's visible, run this flow, then use these environment variables when you're running that flow. And if we look at that login subflow, that looks pretty simple. Just basically tap on, check that you can see a sign in, tap on the email, stick some of that environment variable text into the email field, tap on the password, do the same thing there, tap on login, and then that's what I mentioned about the iOS part. If you're running on an iOS, it'll handle the fact that iOS will pop up this thing saying, hey, do you want to save this in the keychain? No, we don't. So that's, mustn't edit things. I'll just close that and I'll save it. All right. So that's a quick run through of what a Maestro test flow looks like. I have previously prepared, as they say, an emulator with a test run. The nice thing about Maestro is that it also has these cool little kind of commands here, clear state and launch app, which essentially do what they say. They'll clear the state of the app and relaunch the app. So it doesn't matter if I've got some old state or the app running, hanging around from a previous test. If I just do Maestro test, the first thing that will happen is it will clear out that old state. So let me just run it and switch back to here, and you should hopefully see there you go, it restarted, it cleared out the state, so we shouldn't have any previous state from the previous login, and it should, yes, fail, cool, oh, yeah, sorry, I was a bit slow to see that, because I have not done the last bit of what we want, which is fire up the Firebase simulator, because in this case, my backend environment is not a real environment, it's not a real Firebase project, it's actually the Firebase emulator running locally. Of course, as I mentioned previously, what you really want to be doing is running your tests in production, but in this case, because this is a demo, not real life, don't do what I say, but just let me run it against an emulator and ignore my previous advice just for the sake of the demo. So let's run this again, and let's watch the app run, and I'm sure this time it will run no problems and pass. You can see here, it's, oh, here, if I just minimize that, so we can see it's got these nice little emojis telling us it's running, trying to do the input. You can actually see it like a little pixie typing stuff in because it's going all through the accessibility APIs. And it's tapping on login and looks like it's stuck. Shouldn't be taking that long. Ooh, I wonder if something's failed. Hint, hint. I wonder why it failed. Well, you know, like, if you're not eagle-eyed like some members of the audience, we might go, oh, why on earth did that fail? But Maestro Studio is here to help us. So, as I promised, Maestro Studio is a web-based tool. It was 90. No, thank you. Oh. Or did I go Control C on it by mistake? I did. It's just Control click. Right. Okay, so this is Maestro Studio. So that took a bit long. The nice thing about Maestro Studio is this is actually the running app. Like you can see, it's even got the text there and the blinking cursor. It's literally the app that's running in the Android emulator, and it'll be the same deal for iOS, that you can introspect. So here, you can see actually if you're trying to figure out how to do the command to fill in the email, it's got it right here for you. Tap on, well that's because there's already text there, but what you do is tap on email and it would fill it in. Now, it seems to me that something went wrong with the sign in. If we go in here, it says tap on sign in. If we switch back, as our eagle-eyed friend noticed, we've got in our login subflow, tap in to sign, right. Should be sign in, okay. So this was of course a completely on purpose demonstration of how you would use. That's why I called it an IDE. It's not just like a handy tool to look up bits of the UI, but it actually would let you test it. You can see, like, I can just go click that and actually runs the command. There. How fantastic is that? So it's not just like a inspection tool, it'll actually let you control your tests basically like a little REPL. Well, let's close that. Oh dear. I'm already out of time. Jeez. One of the few bad things I have to say about Maestro is every time you kill the studio, it gives you this awful Java stack trace. It's completely benign, but it's still super annoying, so let's clear that out of the way. But now, if I have saved the file, switch back to here, remember I said it will clear the state, so bang, away goes the out, but not just that, it got rid of the logged in state. So you see we're back to the sign-in screen, so it will once again run through the flow. Can you tell that the login is different? I'll show you why that is the case in 1 second. But hopefully now, yay, we can. It's done. It's now logged in, and it's going to tap on the little say hello to Dash, and it got logged in. It did, and it got the expected UI after we said hello to Dash, which was welcome. So, as I just mentioned, the user, like, you probably want a different user each time, because if you've got a real backend, if you keep trying to use the same user, you're going to have state that you don't want. So you want new users every time. But how do you cope with having a new user every time for each time you run the tests? Well, this is where the aforementioned JavaScript integration comes in super handy. You can have JavaScript scripts which basically integrate with your backend systems, and you can essentially call APIs and set things up for your tests. In this case, I have got something called create test user, where I essentially create a random number, use that with my special little API I created, but this would be some sort of backend admin API that you'd have to create the user, a user here with the username. But then also what happens is we export that test, the response comes back with that user's email and password from my little Firebase function, and I export that using output.testUser, and that is in fact what you saw here with these environment variables, sorry, top level, with these environment variables. You see I run this setup API, create test user, and then here, the output, that came from that JavaScript is then used to fill in the email and password when you do the login. So this is super, super helpful, because it means you can essentially set up these tests in whichever way your backend needs and have the correct data then in your UI test to fill in whatever. In this case, it's just a really basic case with the login, but you can imagine all kinds of things. Like if you've got a shopping cart, you could fill in some items or some fake products that you've pre-filled. You could have the user pretend to check out with those items. You could have like pretend credit cards, all sorts, whatever you need for your particular application's domain. So if I switch back to Prezo, that was a very, very quick demo of Maestro, but hopefully it gave you a flavor of all the things you can do and how simple it is. You didn't see me open Android Studio. The only reason I had VS Code open was just to edit YAML files. You could do that like in any text editor under the sun. You could do it in a Word document for all I care. But essentially, anyone, a dev, a QA, a business person, can be shown how to write. And like I can attest to the fact that at my previous employment, that's exactly what happened. Basically, all three classes of those people were able to go in and be shown how to use this tool and start creating tests themselves, because it literally does not require any in-depth knowledge of the code. It's only the business domain knowledge that you need of how the app works. So, now that I've got to the end, I've shown you what Maestro is, how you can use it, how it works, how handy the studio is, and hopefully how easy it is to run these tests. Of course, I'm not here to sprig Maestro, but they have their own kind of test cloud where you can use their Android and iOS devices to run your tests. But there's nothing stopping you running this in your own on-premises test farm, on a commercial test farm, wherever. As you saw, it's just basically a command. Anything that has a way to run a command line with the testing tool will work. And with that, my favourite YouTuber says, share the love, share the knowledge, knowledge is power. Peace. I hope I've shared a little bit of knowledge to give you a little bit of power in your user testing. And thank you very much for your time. There's no time for questions. Yeah? Or are there any questions before I run away? Yes?
So, how do you usually test for multiple language?
I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. There is one thing I didn't show you because I only had 15 minutes, and I even went over time there, is that Maestro has built-in support for locales. So you can actually specify different locales and have different scripts run for different locales. So yes, it does support testing in multiple languages. Is there anyone? Yes?
So Maestro is really dependent on like the visible tags and the properties you set, no matter what platform it is on Android or iOS. But does it support like platform-specific attributes? Like you want to access specific attributes of gestures or buttons and stuff?
Oh, do you mean like particular gestures, like the navigation gestures? Not as much, but I haven't really, to be honest, it might do, and I haven't looked into it. I haven't had the need to do any of that. What I didn't show was that apart from using the semantic tags, it also has a syntax where you can specify the coordinates, usually based on percentage of the screen, like say 40% across, 60% down. So if, for instance, your app is not as accessible as it should be, and the last one I worked on was exactly in that state, in a few cases we need to use just basically screen coordinates to click on a button, because that particular custom button, the person who developed it was a bit naughty and had not added accessibility tags to it. But all the standard components have that in Flutter, and even with your custom components, it's really easy. It's just literally one widget, a semantic widget to add. So there's not really any reason apart from being in a rush that you shouldn't add that and make your app accessible to everyone, which is a good thing. Yes.
Native devices. So can you run it on a real phones, real?
Yes, on Android the story is brilliant because it's just ADB. So I happen to do it on an emulator just to make it easy to show people, but I've run it on a real device. In fact, that was the first way I ran it was on my test phone, no problems. On iOS, where I'm not so much an expert, I believe there's a Facebook tool called IDB which you need to use, and it should work with both the iOS simulator and real iPhones, but that is beyond the scope of my experience. But on Android, yes, real devices, no problems. Any other questions? Yes?
You can disable animations, right? It's like
No, but it actually has built-in delays to cope with animations. So that was kind of one of the things when I said they lean into the flakiness. That's one of the things they do. Like one of the reasons it is a bit slower than, say, other things like Flutter integration tests is they actually have built-in delays to cope with the fact that they need to wait for animations to complete so that the things that you want to see on the screen are actually there by the time it checks for them. So I don't think, it doesn't, because it's not a Flutter specific tool. This is actually, they start off as just an Android and iOS tool, and they've added Flutter and React Native as they went. So there's nothing Flutter specific about it. It's much more built as for native Android apps or native iOS apps. But yeah, I don't think that, as far as I know, they don't have any like turn-off animations. But they have built it specifically to cope with animations. I've exhausted the questions, so please find me afterwards if you do have any that you want to ask me directly, and thank you again.